Split grade printing is a very powerful darkroom technique that gives you insane amounts of control over your global and local contrast. However, this amount of control does come with a few downsides. Let's dive into exactly what you need to know. Okay, so real quick, I just want to go over exactly what split grade printing is. Well, at the root level, it is simply creating a single level of contrast in your print using two different variable contrast filters. So why would you want to use split grade printing? Well, because it just sounds fancy. No, the first reason is because it allows for a very fine tuning of your contrast. Now, normal filters come in half steps, like 2, 2.5, 3. So instead of half steps, split grade printing will allow you to go to even finer adjustments, say quarter steps, eighth steps, and really as fine as you want to get between those actual filters. Next, splitting the exposure between a soft filter and a hard filter allows you to print different levels of contrast in different areas of your print. For instance, you could dodge an area of the print during the soft contrast exposure, as well as burn during the hard contrast exposure. And in the area that you did that, it would increase the contrast relative to the rest of the print. Okay, so that all sounds well and amazing. So what's the problem? Well, the real problem is when you start approaching every negative the same. If I just blindly start making a soft exposure test strip, then subsequently a hard test strip on top of that soft exposure, not really thinking if it's needed, I could just be wasting time and paper. If the negative doesn't require different levels of contrast in different areas to make the print that you want, then there's really no benefit to making these additional tests. Now, the way I determine how I'm going to approach a negative when it comes time to print it in the darkroom is by judging my proofs and my scans on the computer. I find that this is just an invaluable way to come up with a game plan, a plan to making your final print. Now in Lightroom, you can actually make different adjustments in exposure and contrast the same as you would under the enlarger to determine if you're gonna need different areas of contrast in the actual print that you're gonna make. Now, if I evaluate this negative, I can clearly see that I don't have to print any areas of the negative at a different contrast from what the overall contrast is. So I know right away that I can use a quick, simple, straightforward test print to determine my exposure and my contrast. Now, I can still fine tune the print once I'm at this stage. If I need just a little bump in exposure, but not a full half filter, I could give it just a small exposure with a 5 filter on top of the whatever filter you had for the correct contrast. And that will bump up that contrast just a little bit and kind of bring you in between filters. And then in the case of this actual image too, what I would do is burn down this sky area with a 0 or your low contrast filter to keep that sky from burning out. Now, if I contrast that negative with this negative, when I initially shot this, what I envisioned was the emphasis to be on these foreground trees. So I know that in the print here, playing with it in Lightroom, I'm gonna wanna dodge up these trees and increase the contrast to have them be more of a focal point. Then at the same time, the background, which is very heavily lit by the sun, I'm going to lower the contrast in that area. So I know right off the bat that I need at least 2 different contrast levels to get this print how I want it. So it just makes total sense for me to set up a low contrast test strip right away, judge the highlights that way, then give a low exposure to a piece and do a high contrast test strip over the top of that to determine my 2 0 filter and 5 filter exposures right off the bat, because I'm gonna go in and dodge during one and then burn during another. So at that point, it makes sense to spend the extra time and paper to figure it out. The key takeaway here is having a plan going in. Now, before I explain what the other main issue with split grade printing is, I need you to smash that subscribe button. If you want to learn more about darkroom printing, you're not going to want to miss future videos. So the other main problem of approaching every negative with a low filter and a high filter split grade printing method is that you're not getting direct easy to understand feedback from your negatives. The exposure and development is geared for all my negatives to print easily at a grade 2 filter. Now, if I go in and do a straight print at grade 2 and there are just no blacks and it's lacking contrast and punch, I know that I should have developed that negative longer. And opposite of that, if I go to print it and I print for the highlights and the shadow detail just goes into black, I know that I had overdeveloped it and should have developed it less. This is very straightforward feedback, and it's letting you know what's going on with your process, and it's very easy to understand. This really helps me with keeping things consistent. When things start going off track, I can course correct. When you're constantly mixing contrasts with two different filters, it becomes much more difficult to analyze your negatives and get any direct data and feedback from what's actually going on. And this feedback is so important, basically because the better your negatives, just the easier life's gonna be in the darkroom printing those negatives. So if you always split grade print, it can just be generally more difficult to actually figure out what's going on. Not that you can't, it's just not quite as straightforward. Now in the end, it really just boils down to if you love your prints and are happy with them, split grade printing is definitely a tool that can get you there. And if you want to learn more about dialing in split grade printing, check out this video right here.